And now, a little about our presenter. Mary Ellen Carsley is a scientific and botanical illustrator, as well as an art educator. A former practicing architect, she has illustrated 8 books and numerous articles for national and international journals. Her works have been included in the collections of the National Building Museum and the Library of Congress. She is a member of the Guild of Natural Science Illustrators, Maryland Federation of Art, the Art League at the Torpedo Factory, Washington Calligraphers Guild, and the Guild of Bookworkers. We're excited to have Mary Ellen with us here today to teach us how to paint early spring flowers using watercolor. So without further ado, over to you, Mary Ellen.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for coming and joining me in my studio here on this Saturday morning. And especially thank you to those of you who have joined me here before. Welcome back, and I'm glad to have you here again. Today we're going to be focusing on fundamentals of watercolors with early spring flowers, or an early spring flower as our model. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to be focused on we're going to be focusing primarily on the vinca, which is a simple flower. But when I say that, I mean that artistically and not botanically. So those of you who are botanists and master gardeners out there, keep in mind that when I'm using my vocabulary is primarily an artistic one and not a scientific one. Our time together is very short, so what I've done is I've created a resource for you so that you can hopefully paint along with me today. And the resource is on my website, and I'm going to share that screen with you briefly so that you know what it looks like. I believe it was sent to everyone, but this is our course for today, the fundamentals of flowers and watercolor, and everything that I'm going to be going through today is included on this website. So you don't have to worry about taking a lot of notes or worrying about trying to do screen captures or anything like that. Hopefully, I've managed to cover all the information that you would want to take notes on and captured it here on my website. So feel free to use that as a resource, not only while we're going along today, but also as we in the future. One of the things I'm fond of telling all of my students is that once you've had me as a teacher, you now have me for life. So feel free to contact me, to share your work and to share your progress with me as time goes on. So I'm going to switch cameras now because I think my desktop is far more interesting than me. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through some of the basic materials that we have and that I've recommended to you. So it'll take a moment to change. But there we go. So now we're on looking at my desktop here. And what I have here is I have our model. My morning walk was quite fruitful, and I was able to actually get some real vinca for us to have today in the studio. I recommended that you buy actually a kit, but also the kit also includes it includes everything that I had listed individually as well. But I wanted to walk folks through some fundamentals because I think watercolor sometimes can be intimidating because it has a lot of vocabulary involved with it that you may or may not be familiar with. So the first thing is talking about the paper, and you're going to notice right away this is a watercolor. This is a watercolor block. This is actually one of my favorites. I enjoy this in fact is a postcard block, and I love sending postcards to people from sketches when I've gone walking. And you're going to notice that it says 140-pound paper. So that refers to the thickness of the paper. Also, too, you're going to notice that the texture here, this says that it is cold pressed. So you're going to notice that with the cold pressed paper that there is always going to be a little more texture to it. A hot press paper is like the paper that I have here that I'll be painting on here today, is a much, much smoother paper. So that's the difference between hot press and cold press. I'm using a 90-pound paper today that I'll be painting on, and you'll notice that with the 90-pound paper, because it's not in a block where it is reinforced and attached on the sides to keep it from buckling when the water cuts on it. It'll make little hills and valleys sometimes. This adhesive on the side of the block, and that's why they call it a watercolor block, it will help keep it from buckling. It's also why I've taped my drawing down today to avoid that buckling. So if you don't have a block, you can just tape it down to a drawing board, or just watch the amount of water that you use to avoid excessive buckling. When you have a block, you're always going to notice there's a secret corner or a little secret spot where you can get the paper released from the block once you're finished painting. And that's what this chiseled tip on the end of a watercolor brush is for. It's for just sliding it right underneath there and then popping it right off of that adhesive, and then you're able to pull the sheet off the block easily. So that gives you a little bit of background about the papers. So hot press, cold press, 90-pound, 140-pound paper. Generally, the higher the number, the thicker the paper. 90-pound and up to 140 pounds will suit most of your needs. If you did order the kit that came with a watercolor pad, have no fear. This is perfect. This paper in here is about 140-pound paper. It might be a little less, might be 120-pound paper. It's pretty thick, and you can also see the texture on it, so we know that it's cold press. So now the question.
We did have a question about paper here. Do you need to wet the paper before taping it down in order to stretch it if using a single sheet of watercolor paper?
That's a great question. And no, you do not need to do that. If you're using a very, very heavy paper, like a 300-pound paper, you would need to do that. But in the case of the lighter, the thinner papers, you do not need to do that. But great question. Thank you, Libby. And then if you're just doing field sketching in your sketchbook, as I said, just be careful with the amount of water that you're putting on the page, and you don't really need to worry about the buckling. So I'll set those aside for a moment, and then let's talk about brushes, because brushes can be pretty overwhelming sometimes. Now on my website, you're going to notice that I have a picture under the references of the various different kinds of brushes. But as a beginner, the only brushes you really need to worry about are brushes that are referred to as rounds, okay, which refer to this area here of the brush, okay, that is round there, or flats. Sometimes they're also called brights or wash brushes as well, and then a detail brush. The smaller the number, the smaller the brush, okay? The larger the area that you're painting, the larger the brush. So I like to start with a brush that's usually around a 4 or a 6. That's the brush here, okay? You can see about the size it is relative to my finger. And brushes always come with a little bit of starch in their, to keep their bristles together. So you want to make sure before you use a brush, you give it a good wash in your water, and then just gently daub that, and then wash it again. And once you see the bristles spreading freely on the paper towel, then you've washed out all of the starch and you don't need to worry about it. You always want to store your brushes nicely so that in such a way that all the bristles are together. And you never want to leave your brush sitting in the water like that. Brushes have natural capillary action, which means they act just like sponges. These bristles pull the fluid up into the brush itself, and eventually that will end up destroying the brush. So when a brush isn't in use, always rinse it clean, okay? And then if you want to make sure that it's absolutely clean, you don't have any pigment in it, squeeze it a little bit at the base of the brush and then squeeze it out, bringing all those bristles together and set it aside. Today, what we're going to be doing is I'm really only going to be using one brush today. And all the other brushes have various specialized uses. As you can imagine, this one works, this flat brush that has, or wash brush that has this angled edge is wonderful for getting into tight corners and to laying out flat washes. This brush is for large areas to lay out washes. And then needless to say, this little tiny fellow is perfect for doing details, especially for flowers. So I find that if you have basically one flat and a 6, a 4, and a 2, you're just fine. And this is an inch wide flat, and you'll notice that this one's about a 1/2 inch wide flat. So these are really the brushes. These are my workhorse brushes, the ones I do the most with. And as I said, there are other brushes that are there for specialties. But the important thing to remember is there's not really any rules about this, in the sense that if you find that one brush works really well for you, then use it. Then in a certain way, by all means, go for it and use it. All these years I've been painting, I've never yet been received a citation from the watercolor police. So I think you can use brushes any way you want. So today what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be using my number 6 brush. Okay, so I'm going to keep that aside, but I will be keeping my detail brush handy and probably 1 or 2 of these flats. I think the smaller flat, especially since my drawing is a little bit on the smaller side today. Just so you have a sense of scale, and I'm going to shift my camera just a little bit here. You have a sense of scale here. You'll see I already did my underdrawing, and I'm working on a drawing that's about 4 inches by 6 inches. We're going to talk about this a little bit more in a minute. What I did want to talk to you about, though, too, is about paint. Now, paint can be a little bit intimidating as well, like the brushes can be. And one of the things that you want to keep in mind with your paint is that you can get either pan watercolor, which is what this kit, the Koi kit, is here. Oh, and I neglected to mention, this is one of the brushes that you can use. This actually keeps the water. This is wonderful for field sketching. It keeps the water in the handle of the brush. It takes a little bit of a knack to get to using it, but it fits together just like an old-fashioned fountain pen. You just remove the stopper. This is for keeping the water in when you're in transit. You remove the stopper, and then you simply place the reservoir inside the brush tip, or calligraphers would say the nib of the brush, and then just a few gentle squeezes, and you have and then your brush is ready to go and ready to wet the pan watercolor. Okay, the sponges on the side are for daubing your brush, for controlling the amount of fluid that's in the water, that's in the brush itself. So you have those there to keep those handy. You can also use them at different times for daubing also on your painting to get different effects. And we'll talk a little bit about that once we get painting. I'm going to set this brush aside, but I encourage you to experiment with that. And then I'll show you the paints that we have here. Now, my husband, who is also an artist, would be horrified that I am sharing my palette with you. It is the one thing that in over 20 years of an amicable partnership we have not agreed on at all, is my tendency for a messy palette. He has a very fussy and neat palette. I tend to like to keep my colors. It's a sort of mnemonic for me, helping me remember which things I use to mix where. But you'll notice that in this palette that I have here, this is a standard plastic palette that has seen a lot of usage. doesn't, it was at one time one piece. It is not anymore, but I love it so much I can't let it go. And these are actually tube watercolors, okay? When you use this palette, you just fill in each of the pans with the watercolor of your choice. And in doing that, now, when you buy a kit, kits often come with, I'll set that aside just so you're aware of that. The other thing that you should be aware of too is that when you buy tube watercolors, you're going to notice that they very, very often have a mineral name. So, so for example, you might have something that is a malachite green or say a cadmium yellow or things, and artist colors tend to be named by the mineral that they come from or by the artist that first made the mineral mixture. So, so they will not often be synonymous with what we would consider like decorator colors. So, so for example, aubergine is a kind of purple. You're really going to be looking at different names for your colors, and they often change from brand to brand. So I do make note from time to time of the different brands of watercolor. So if I like this green, this olive green that's made by Winsor Newton, I'll actually make a note of that on my palette because they do vary from company to company. Now the pan watercolors are perfect for especially when you're getting started, because there's a little bit of fussing that one has to do to set up a palette like this, to have it to be very useful. So pan watercolors I really highly recommend for beginners, and this way you have your palette set for you. And what you want to do is when you're using your watercolors, and we'll get started doing a little bit of painting on some scrap paper here, what you want to do is just, when you're first working with new colors, you're going to notice that I wet my brush rather thoroughly, and then I tend to roll my brush as I'm working in the pan, the watercolor pan. I'm going to do just a little graduated wash, which is a great practice to warm up. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put my hue down. So that is that is my color that I'm using, my blue hue. Okay, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to progressively, I'm going to take and I'm going to move my water just a little closer so you can see. You're noticing I'm taking pigment out of my brush, and I'm just taking that water down. I'm just dragging the pigment. You have to think about the physics a little bit here. You're keeping mineral particles suspended in water, and you're altering the concentration of those particles so you can get a beautiful graduated wash that goes from very, very intense pigment all the way down to letting the white of the paper show through to very, very pale, like robin's egg blue. A lovely, lovely color, especially for spring. So I'll come down a little bit closer so you can see that, okay? The next thing that you want to keep in mind, another technique that we're going to be using is we have our primary colors here, and you can see I already have an example. So when we add white, which means we're in watercolor as opposed to oil painting, when we add white, it means we're adding water, we're thinning the pigment and allowing, because watercolor is a transparent medium, we're allowing the paper to show through. When we add that, we're getting a tint of the hue that we began with. Then when we add the opposite on the color wheel, the color that's opposite it, and in this case with red, okay, we'll do the red right here. I'll give you an example that you're noticing I'm really washing out that pigment, and then I can always check it on my paper towel to make sure that I've gotten all of that off. I also tend to move around the lip of this because you'll notice that I have blue on one side there. So moving that around so I don't contaminate my watercolor, the pan. So I'm getting that red. Notice that I tend to use the flat side of the brush, the broad side of the brush, and I'm rotating it so I get the pigment even. And this time I'm going to start in the middle with the most intense concentration of the pigment, okay? And I'm going to thin that out by just adding water to my brush, taking the pigment out, and then using the water to create that tint. Now, this is a terrific little exercise that will really help you gain a great deal of control with your watercolor. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that red and I'm going to add the opposite color of it. I'm going to actually add green. Now, not so much green. You saw that was just a touch. I'll actually calm down so you can see. I added just the tiniest amount there. I might have to add a little more red. We do not want to see that green. We just want that green to make the red darker. Add a little bit more. And I'll keep adding progressively more green. As soon as I see the green, I know I need to go back and add a little more red. And we're always keeping the red, the dominant pigment in the concentration, but the green is there to darken it down. And look at that, we can get it to extremely, right to a maroon, a nice deep maroon color. So that's our basic color theory that we're using when we're painting with watercolor. Now, the next technique that you're going to need, besides the graduated wash, okay, is a fun little technique that I know you're going to want to be playing with for a long time. You can make little glass spheres for yourself. These are very fun to do. So let's take the robin's egg blue. It's such a pretty color. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to paint a circle. And I'm going to keep it, and for right now, I'm making it pretty even in the concentration of the pigment all the way around. So now what I'm going to do, I have my little circle. I'm going to take my brush, and I've cleaned my brush out completely, and I've also removed most of the water from my brush. My brush is dry, and I'm going into the wet watercolor, and I'm lifting out. Okay, lifting out a highlight. There we go. So I'm lifting out that highlight, and then I'll do just a little bit of a reflected light back here. Okay, we want to make sure that we get this very, very bright here. We can really take that out. The reflected light is always a little less bright. And then what we want to make sure is, I'm going to be very, very careful and make sure that when we cast our shadow, okay, and we're going to cast our shadow to be a little bit darker, I'm going to be very careful as I go up here close. I'm actually going to leave a little, you're going to notice I'm going to leave a little skinny bit of the white there because I don't want to go into that quite yet until I'm sure it's dry. And there we go. We have a little cast shadow there. Always darkest closest to the object. I'll add a little darker blue there, cool that down. And then again, that cast shadow is a graduated shadow that we have. And then it starts, and let me bring my camera down, and you can see that. You can have a great deal of fun drawing these. And if you do have children in the house and they have marbles, one of the best exercises for really gaining a great deal of facility with watercolor is to paint marbles and to paint them. Now you'll notice that this is a classic drawing exercise as well, where we have our highlight, okay, our cast shadow, which is a graduated wash in watercolor. It's darkest closest to the object and then fades as it goes away. And then we always have a little bit of reflected light. This is the light that's bouncing off of the ground plane back onto the surface of the object. Okay, so we always have that there as well. So those are our fundamentals. With one last one, you notice I did avoid bringing that in because I wanted a nice tight edge to my sphere. But often in botanicals, that is not the case. And in order to get the effect that we want sometimes, we will work in what's called wet into wet. This works beautifully for backgrounds as well. So suppose that in this case I have a flower that has a yellow center. I may want to let that bleed into the petal. And for our leaves, we will definitely be doing this. And I will let the watercolor do the work itself. And so that, and you'll see as we go along painting our vinca, how we can use this wet into wet technique. Now, in watercolor, it can be, we're going to begin painting with our underdrawing here. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about styles in watercolor as well. Now, as a botanical illustrator, particularly when I'm working with scientific subjects, I have to work where the what's referred to as being tight, and also dry brushing. Dry brushing is when you use very, very little water in your brush and you're really almost drawing with the pigment. Watercolor, as we traditionally know it, tends to be, and here's one of our finished piece that we're going to be shooting for today, tends to be a bit looser than that. And what we have is where we allow that wet into wet to create those beautiful natural changes in color and light on the surface of our subject. So we can find a balance in doing that, and today that's what we're going to work with. Is more of a looser style than a scientific illustration style. So it just depends on my mood, to be perfectly honest with you, about how, when I'm just approaching a subject for myself. Now, hopefully, most of you out there, as I said, we have our subject here. One of the ways I prefer to begin always is, sitting outside with my sketchbook and sketching my subject. But if I'm in the studio or I know I don't have a lot of time, I'm fond of taking pictures with my cell phone. And this one I took myself. I definitely highly recommend to you that you take your own pictures. And this is to hone your eye for composition. Also, too, when someone takes a picture, you decide where the flower is going to be, where it's going to be, not only in the center of the picture, but relative to the leaves. You're making all of those artistic choices. So the key with art is always practice, practice, practice. Now, it is true, some people are born with a gift, but Michelangelo, he is known to have created, in his long life of practice, over 80 years of practice, he did 800 works of art that we know of, and many, many sketches. And he's famous for saying, "I'm always learning." So keep that in mind. You always want to take every opportunity to use your eye, to use your hand. You get just a little bit more practice, you're just a little bit better every single time. So I took this picture of the vinca. You see that on the website there. And the trick about using just a simple printout with your pencil to get the underdrawing. You're going to notice the underdrawing is light, and that's on purpose because we want to make sure that that pencil line is not overwhelming because we have a transparent medium that we're working with. The next thing that I like to do is I like to get a piece of the same scrap watercolor, the same paper that I'm using, just a scrap piece. And you'll notice that what I've done is I've set my palette. Now, because this is a new palette for me, okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to look to see which one I'm going to use as my purple. There we go. There's my permanent violet. It's going to be right there. And that one. It looks like we have the ultramarine blue right nearby. That's up here. This is ultra blue. You always know ultramarine blue because if you hold it next to a purple, you're going to notice that there's a little bit of red in the ultramarine blue. We're going to need that to cool down that purple. To remember, purple is the combination of red and blue. So we're just adjusting the balance again of those pigment particles. And then we're going to look at a nice green here. It looks like, I think that's a little too green for our purposes. We need something a little bit, this is more of a sap green, and let's see, that looks like the sap green and our grass green is going to be a little bit more what we're looking at, maybe here. There we go. This is more what we want. So I'm making note of which colors that I'm going to actually be using. These original colors were from my other messy palette that I showed you. The messy palette that I love, that my husband doesn't understand me for. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. So let's go ahead.
Ellen, real quickly before you get into this, someone asked if you have tips so you don't have too much water on your brush, or to correct how to correct it if you do.
Oh, okay, that's great. That's what your little sponges and what you can see my handy dandy paper towel is for. Also, too, this is another thing. Actually, my husband introduced me to these blue towels. These are, you don't buy these in the cleaning aisle, or the paper aisle. You actually buy these in like the mechanic or the shop section. And these blue towels are wonderful in that they're super, super absorbent. The only thing that's a little tough is when you're cleaning your brush, you can't always see the pigment on the blue towel, but I do love these for their durability and absorbency. And when we're adjusting the pigment on the brush, a lot of this comes from practice. I'm not going to lie to you. When I'm doing that, you've noticed that I was testing on my paper, and I was keeping that piece of scrap paper handy so that I dip in first. I tend to wipe off once or twice on the edge of my water container, and then I fully load the brush, okay? And then I go to wherever I'm going to begin with the dark pigment. Depending on how you're going to want to tend to work from highest concentration to lowest concentration. And then always, you don't want this to be so soppy. Notice that this didn't roll around. Like if I had lots and lots of water and then it would start to run, I don't keep quite that much water on my brush. So you want to keep it thoroughly wet, but not runny. I hope that answers the question. It's such a qualitative thing, but you'll get accustomed to it once you've been painting for a while.
Thanks, Marilyn.
So,
That's great.
okay, good. So let's go ahead and get started now. The other thing you probably wondered with this kit was what was going on here is this little table that you have, and this actually is a palette, is an extra palette, and it's really quite wonderful because what you can do is, and I'm going to pull my camera out a bit, what you can do is you can mix up a bunch of your colors that you want to have. You can do all your blending here. So this will be my darker purple here. Okay, and I'm going to be, since I have my vinca here, I'm going to be doing a little color matching here. Make sure that I can get, I think I prefer this. Okay, and I'm going to get started with this. I'm going to use a little more water than I normally would, and I'm going to work directly from there, and I'm going to get started on my first petal. And what I'm doing is I'm actually using the tip of that brush to go right up against that pencil line. Now, notice that I kept all of that pigment, and now I'm going in and I'm treating it as a graduated wash. Now, you might be concerned, you might say, oh, but goodness, there's darker and lighter areas in there. That's okay, because we can come back in and take care of that. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a clean brush now, because I know this is a very light area here. I'm going to come back in, I'm going to push the pigment back a little bit, lift that out, and I notice that, and I actually have my photo reference here that I'm using. I notice that, oop, there we go. We can use some of that wet into wet technique where I can put in just that little dark area and push that pigment around just a bit with the tip of my brush, just very gently. Maybe add a little more purple. It was a little bluer than I wanted it to be. That's okay. You can go with it. And I'm going to leave that petal for right now. I might add just a little over here. And we're going to let the water, just let the water do the work for us there. Let's do another petal. We're going to go right over to the petal next to it. Again, start in the same way, okay? Again, keeping that higher concentration towards the edge of the petal, because that's the nature of the vinca. The vinca has that, and it fades towards the center. There will be flowers that will go the opposite way. I'm going to pull this in, keeping it pretty, again, pulling that back out, keeping it pretty light towards the center there. There's a little bit of a crease with a little indentation in the petal there. And I'm going to pull that right back out like that. And I'm going to continue around. Make this a little more intense, so not too, there we go, that's what I wanted. A little bit darker, because I'm adding just a little bit of a darker, a little bit of that ultramarine blue to mix with my purple there, just to give that petal turning down just a little, working with it while it's wet, so that, again, the water is kind of doing the work for me. Add a little more purple to that. I want it to be a dark purple and not a blue. Leave that. Okay, and now I'm going to come back in here, and I'm going to begin with my next petal, again starting at that edge, keeping the concentration there. Now I want to be a little careful here. These petals, I don't want to run one into the other, so I get, there we go, I wanted that to be a little warmer in there. And then moving around to that edge, and then see when I keep this darker and cooler on this edge, I get that wonderful sense that that petal's just a little turned down. I'm going to pull out that lightness in the center. I think I need to do that here. I think this got a little concentrated. I'm going to pull that out in the center there. There you go. Now look at that. You didn't think you could be, but you are. You are 2/3 of the way through painting your first spring flower. It's a good day. I'm going to keep that. You'll notice that sometimes I mix directly on my painting. As I said, that's the great part of watercolor. It's a very freeing kind of medium. There's no real rules. You can set your palette ahead of time. I definitely, if you're not familiar with painting, I highly recommend that you do set your palette ahead of time so that you get used to doing your planning your. Now you notice so you get used to planning your palette. Now you notice I added a good deal more ultramarine there. That's because we have a cast shadow. This petal is curved down, and there's a little bit of a shadow. So I'm using the water, working back up into that soft, but I work pretty quickly because I don't want to let it dry. You know, this is the genius of Winslow Homer. You know, he was painting in the Caribbean most of the time, where it's quite warm. And that's both good and bad because watercolor is a hurry up and wait medium. I'm quoting one of my younger students, and when I say that, and I think he was absolutely right when he said that. Now, what I'm going to do is I have things pretty well set, but since the painting is partially dry, this is a great opportunity for me to use the tip of my brush and come in and correct a few things. Maybe the water went in a direction I wasn't quite anticipating. Maybe I need to highlight someplace, or I can make a little fold in another place. There we go. And that's working out quite nicely. So we're going to let that dry because the other things that we have to add to this are details, and it's not quite ready for that. We would have some bleeding involved, but here's a place where we're going to use the bleed. Now, I'm going to continue using this brush, okay? Because I know most of you or many of you just bought either the kit or a limited number of brushes. However, this is a situation where you could go in with one of the flats and work. I'll show you both so that you have the opportunity to see that. If I were going, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to use this leaf. I'll move our subject out of the way for a moment, and I'm going to start with this leaf, these two leaves up here, because they're out of the way of my petals, and I don't have to worry about. I won't have to worry about getting any bleeding that's undesired. So what I'm doing here is right now I'm mixing up a base. I added just a little bit of that very, very bright yellow, but I'm using mostly this more earth tone yellow. And what this is this is actually going to be what's referred to as an underwash. Okay, we have underdrawings, but we also have underwashes. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the tip of my flat, okay, and I'm actually going to put this underwash loosely where the veining is, because you'll notice that we always get just a little bit on the vinca vine, particularly. The veins are a little bit of a lighter green. So we're going to leave that there, let that dry for just a moment, and while that's drying, I'm going to mix up my green that I want here. Looks like I'm gonna have to fuss with this just a little. Oh, that's right. I did use that one. There we go. That's a little more like it. More grass green. Sometimes you want to, especially when you're painting in nature, you want to avoid the more candy colors. Okay, so now we have this. We're going to begin using, and I'll show you, I haven't forgotten, I will show you how to do this with the round. I'm going to go in with my flat, and I'm going to, you'll notice that this is pretty wet. I'm coming in and I'm actually going over a bit of sort of loose way, going over those veins just a little. That yellow is going to show through. I had a chance to dry. And right here, I'm going to and you can see how I use the edge of the flat to get the edge of the leaf. Now, the flat is handy as well in that it allows me to come in and it allows me to come in and keep hard edges and lines. So I'm coming in to the leaf here and I'm putting in where I see those shadows, those dark areas on my leaf. And again, letting the water do the work. Now, again, I'm going to come in with a little bit. You're probably wondering, how did she darken that down so suddenly? Well, what I did was I put a little bit of the ultramarine blue in there. Don't worry, I'm not going to lose those leaves, those veins in the leaves. And you can see you can use that. I'm going to let this, I overshot a little there. I'm rushing. My apologies. There we go. I'm starting to, and if you do overshoot, like I did there, don't panic. Clean your brush, nice and clean, okay? And then you're going to come in with your brush almost dry and just lift off that edge. See, there we go. Now we're back to a nice crisp edge there. We're going to let that dry for a minute. Just let that do its thing. Oh, I see there's a big highlight on that. I don't want you to think, there you go. I didn't want you to think that that was a white spot there. It looked like it on the camera for a second. Now let's go in with our other, this area is quite dark. And it's okay if those two leaves bleed into one another.
And Mary Ellen, I did want to let you know we've got about 8 minutes or so left in the class, but also to remind you to show the round brush as well as the flat.
Oh, thank you, thank you. I just started. Livy, what would I do without you? Okay, so I'm switching brushes. My bad. Thank you, Livy. See, you get into the zone, and then you just. That's what I hope happens for all of you. I hope you go out and you find some kind of flower, and time and space and everything just disappears. You know, there's just been so much going on, and I don't know of any other way to celebrate those little wonderful things in life and to get back in touch with those wonderful little things in life, like drawing and painting. But I have Livy to keep me grounded, which is a good thing. Not always. Not always the best. My mother told me I had a time competency issue. I think it's still true, even at this date. I think this is absolutely true. So you can see how I'm using the brush. I'm going to use it in a similar way as I did with the flat. I came right up to the edges with the tip, and then what I'm going to do now, I can come back in with this. Oh, this is so much fun, and we can pull out little highlights up here. And again, just keeping, and any place where I'm not particularly happy with, how the pigment sort of settled itself in. And then there's a few areas where, now in this case, you could actually go in with the tiny brush, but I like to use the very, very edge of my brush. Sometimes it's fun to go in and push in some of this dark pigment while you're lifting and reinforcing those veins right next to, and so you create a point of contrast between the dark green and that little bit of yellow underwash that you did. And you can start to pull that out. Now, needless to say, if I was going to do a really large area, and I wanted it all completely covered, I would most definitely use a large flat brush. But in painting these smaller areas like this, you really, it's actually up to you. I'm going to darken this down in this area because it's sinking down behind. I want it to be really clear that this is darker and behind that. And I'm going to blend some of that out like that. Now, let's go back. Let's let those leaves dry for right now. And let's go back to finishing off our flower. This is where I, again, would either use the very, very tip of my brush. And since we're doing this mostly with one brush, let's stick with that. Now, you're going to notice that inside these flowers, they have a delightful little star that's a dark purple. So I'm going to come in and I'm going to do the point of the star on each one. Okay, and then I'm going to take my brush, no pigment, just wet, and I'm just at the edge. I'm going to add just a little tiny bit of water, and look at that. That gives us, and I'll bring that down so you can see, and that gives us just such that beautiful little shift of values. There we go. It gives us the center of the flower. And now here's the fun part. Here's the part that you've been wanting to do. You're going to go back to that yellow that you were using. And you're going to go ahead and put that little center in. And if it bleeds a little, that's not a big deal. That's okay. Flowers do that. Their colors sometimes, they merge into one area to another just very gently. I'm going to put a little bit of that in there. Now, here's the one that I did before, okay? So you can see that and that. I'm actually more pleased with the one that I've done in class here today. I'm glad you got to see one of the good ones at least. But you can see here how we have a little bit of that wet into wet technique here, and how the leaves work out so that you can see that bit of that yellow underwash. Notice that in the background, I did add just some faded leaf shapes just to take up some of that background, to give it a sense of space, and that it was occupying, space and somewhere on the ground there. as they go along. They're such happy little flowers. They're always like one of the first ones to come out. You know, they find they're in some spot of sunshine, and whenever you see one, even if the sun's not shining on it, you know that's a sunny spot at some point in the day. And so I wanted to capture that when I did that little bright spot of sunshine there. So it's this beautiful little purple flower among all these leaves. And you'll notice how we keep all of the things, the more vivid colors are coming forward. We keep the background more muted. That gives us that illusion of space on our canvas. And then we also create these opportunities for where the petals turn from going from dark to light to give it some motion and some life to it. And we also look for balance, right? We have a lot of a lovely sense of balance from the top to the bottom, and then just a little bit off center to create some movement, a little bit of diagonal movement on the canvas as well.
Mary Ellen,
so I think we're done.
We're almost at time, but we have a couple questions. So if you wouldn't mind staying for maybe like an extra 5 minutes to answer some questions.
I would love to.
That would be awesome. So we had someone ask, do you have to do an underdrawing?
No, not at all. I will tell you that if you go to my website, the magnolias that are there, I think if it doesn't really count as an underdrawing. I think there's like 4 or 5 lines that I started with in pencil, and then I was just like, you know what? I'm just going to go for it. So I no, absolutely not. You don't need an underdrawing.
Great. So this person asked, it's a statement and then a question. So this person has worked with pencil drawings for years and is inclined to use the brushes in a pencil drawing kind of way. Is that wrong? And does this person need to break their habits?
Oh, that's a good question. Now, the only thing that I would say is, so when you hold a pencil, there's a tendency that you want to rest the heel of your hand down. Now, if you are accustomed to drawing, especially charcoal drawing will definitely break you of this habit. You need to really draw from your elbow and from your shoulder, and so you don't rest down. You do not rest the heel of your hand down on the surface. That's really problematic for watercolor if you do that, because you're going to be, inevitably you will set your hand into a wet spot. It's also problematic for watercolor too, because you have natural oils on your hands, and those oils can actually get on your paper and create a resist spot where the watercolor will bead over it. So it's really important to kind of keep your hands off your page if you can, and then you'll notice that I paint my wrist on the heel of my hand is not resting down on the ground. It's actually up a bit always. So I'm always painting a little more. Actually, let me change the angle. So I'm painting a little more like that. So. I'm trying to do it. There we go. That's what I was saying.
There you go. Yes.
I'm painting a little more like that. I'm painting more like this and not like this, if that makes sense.
That totally makes sense.
I hope I didn't make you seasick doing that too.
It's okay. It's okay. We have one more question for you. Should you ever try to use an eraser for lines after it's dry?
Oh, you can do that, but I would wait a good 2 days before you did that, okay? Because you run the risk of it peeling up. But yeah, I mean, everybody has that time where you're just like, oh, just darn it, I made that one line too long. And then every time you look at the drawing, your eye immediately goes to that line, so you like want to get rid of it. So what I would say is, and I guess I can stop sharing my camera now. So what I would say is that, yeah, I would just wait. And if you do use, I would recommend that you use one of the white plastic erasers. If I have one handy, I do. I can't believe it. You have to trust me. It is white. It's just seen a lot of mileage, but one of the white plastic erasers is the best to use. They're the gentlest.
Awesome. Well, Mary Ellen, I just want to thank you so much for being with us today and sharing all this. It's been an excellent class. And so I just, yeah, really want to thank you and thank everyone else for joining us today.